Hey everyone. So in this video, we're going to be talking about the New Testament history and timeline. We're going to be going through the events of the New Testament, and then we're going to go through some relevant context and background information as well. So let's jump right into it. To start, why are we talking about this? Well, as I have listed here, the scriptures, for the most part, were written in languages that we don't read. They're coming from cultures that we don't understand from thousands of years ago. And so if we want to just read the scriptures without learning about them, then we're going to miss a lot of what the scriptures can provide us. And there's this quote that I really like. It comes from L.P. Hartley. He said, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." And I think this is super relevant and applies to what we're talking about today, because if we don't try and understand these ancient people and these ancient cultures, I think we will often fail to understand or think we've understood, but really, misunderstand what's going on in the scriptures. So, to get started, I wanted to cover some language stuff real quick, starting with the languages of the New Testament. So the New Testament manuscripts were written in Koine Greek. Greek was chosen because it was the lingua franca of the ancient world. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why this is. This is because of Hellenization, so we'll come back to that term in just a little bit. It's important for us to note that the Jews did not, start out speaking Greek. They originally spoke Hebrew. This was not the case by the time of Christ, and this is because if you think back to Old Testament times, you had the Babylonians come in just shortly after 600 BC, and they conquered Jerusalem and hauled a bunch of people off as captives back to Babylon. And Babylon, the native language was Aramaic, and so the Jews who were taken to Babylon, they adopted Aramaic, and when they were eventually allowed to return to Israel, they brought Aramaic with them. So by the time of Jesus, Aramaic was the common language of the Jewish people, so Jesus would have grown up speaking Aramaic. In spite of this fact, the Jewish scriptures were still mainly written in Hebrew. There were some Greek texts of the Hebrew scriptures as well, called the Septuagint, but we aren't going to talk about those a whole ton in this video. So now moving on to some history. If we want to understand the New Testament, we actually have to start a little bit before the New Testament. And just trust me on this, it'll make way more sense if we start before the beginning. Anyway, and so the starting place that I've chosen is the end of the Old Testament, because you need to understand the intertestamental period. Ideally, we would start at the beginning of the New Testament, and you would understand all of that perfectly, because the Old Testament is vital to understanding the New Testament. But we're just going to assume some basic background knowledge about the Old Testament, because if we tried to go through all of that in one video, it would be like a 10-hour video. So we're going to start with the prophet Malachi. He's traditionally understood to be the last prophet of the Old Testament, and we think that his book was probably written around the year 420 BC. And so at this time, Judea is under Persian rule. And so if you think back to Cyrus the Great, the one who allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, he was Persian. Similarly, Darius from the story of Daniel in the lion's den, he was Persian. So the Jews are still under this same rule of the Persian Empire. And I have a map on the right-hand side that shows the Persian Empire and then highlights where Israel was situated within that empire. And so at this time period, the Jews were relatively autonomous. They rebuilt the temple, they were practicing Judaism, and all of that is described in the books from Ezra to Nehemiah. Anyway, they were just kind of doing their thing. Everything was great under the Persian rule, for the most part. And then as a quick side note, the scriptures don't go silent at the end of the Old Testament, because obviously there is a large gap in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, but people did not stop writing during this period. And so the writings of this intertestamental period are sometimes referred to as the Apocrypha. And this was actually considered to be valid scripture by many Jews during the time period. Not all of them, because there were actually numerous denominations of Judaism, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a little bit. But many Jews, like I said, did consider these texts to be authoritative. And some texts from the Apocrypha are actually referenced in the New Testament. So I have an example here of a New Testament reference to the Apocrypha. The Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 2, verses 12 to 20, they have the same subject material as Matthew 27, verses 41 to 43. And I'll just give a brief description here. If you want to read the verses on your own time, feel free. I would encourage you to. It's really interesting. But essentially, in Wisdom of Solomon, it describes the persecution of a righteous man. He's referred to as the Son of God. He's condemned for his words. He's tested through suffering. He's mocked by people who basically ask him to demonstrate his power, and then they will believe in him, which sounds an awful lot like Christ on the cross being mocked by the Jewish leaders, saying that if he's truly the Son of God, he should come down from the cross, and then they will believe in him. It seems very likely that Matthew was referencing this section of the Wisdom of Solomon. I've listed some other examples here. I won't go through each of them in detail, but I would encourage you to look at these on your own time. They're really interesting. And I guess I'll just make a note about this word I have here, pseudepigrapha. There's a slight difference between the Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigrapha essentially means false writing, and so it's the idea that there's a book that's claiming to be written by someone, but it is in fact not written by someone. And so First Enoch, which I have listed here, is an excellent example of this. It claims to have been written by Enoch, but it wasn't written in the right time period, so it wasn't actually written by Enoch, hence false writing. And there are lots of books that would fall into this category. I distinguish the Apocrypha from these books because the apocryphal books aren't claiming to be written by, at least usually, they're not claiming to be written by anyone specifically. So they're not being falsely attributed. It's just, these are some things that are going on, and doesn't specify necessarily who's writing them. So, if you're interested in the Apocrypha, I have read through it myself, and I think it's really great, really interesting. And so if you are wanting to kind of learn a little bit more about it, I've listed some books here that are worth your time. Tobit, Judith, and Bel and the Dragon are more of like a narrative form, and they're a little shorter, so they're more accessible, you know, if you've not really delved much into this topic before. First through fourth Maccabees, they're a little bit denser. It's more of the history that was going on in between the Old and New Testament, so not as interesting of a read, but really, important if you want to understand this time period. All right, now back to the history. So, as I mentioned before, the Jews were under Persian rule, and we now kind of enter this period called the Silent Years, where there were no biblical narratives, but history is obviously still going on. The Persians are in control. The Jewish temple is doing normal temple stuff, and for the most part, everything's pretty peaceful, and this period comes to an end when Persia is conquered by Alexander the Great, and that takes place in 332 BC. And so now we have Hellenistic rule. So like I said, in 332, Alexander the Great conquers the Persian Empire, and he takes control of Judea, the land of Israel. And so this Hellenistic or Greek influence begins to spread. And so this is what I was talking about earlier, Hellenization. So this is the idea that Greek language, culture, and ideas began to mingle with Jewish society, and not just Jewish society, the other societies that were conquered by Greek-speaking peoples as well. So I have a map here. In fact, I have two maps here. So Alexander was from Macedon, and this top map shows what he started out with in terms of the land that he ruled. And then this bottom map shows what he had control over at the time of his death. And so he died in 323 BC, and unfortunately for him, I guess at least, when he died, his empire immediately fell apart, and his generals split up the empire. So I have some maps here that demonstrate that. And you can see from this top map here, there were quite a few people who were vying for control. Fortunately for us, they were great at killing each other. So very quickly, things kind of get simplified as people take over their competitors' land, and we end up with a much simpler map. And so you can see here the two biggest kingdoms that remained were the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic kingdoms, and those are the ones that are most important for us. And so initially, Ptolemy, who was based in Egypt, he and his successors controlled Judea, but they were eventually defeated in 198 BC by the Seleucids. And so during this time, with Seleucid rule, many Jews began to adopt Greek customs. This is that Hellenization that I was talking about earlier. But not everyone does. Some resist. And so we have this period of time in which the Hebrew scriptures are translated into Greek, the Septuagint, like I mentioned earlier. And this is really helpful because there's this group called the diaspora. These are Jews who are no longer living in Israel. They're still living in Greek-speaking areas. They speak Greek, so it's great for them that the scriptures are translated into Greek. But because not everyone is super happy about this Hellenization, we start to see some factions form. Some people want to stay true to their Jewishness, and some are more okay to varying extents with assimilating into the dominant culture. And so this will come up a little bit more later when we talk about some of the denominations of Judaism. So the next thing that is important for us to know is the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. So he becomes the king of the Seleucid kingdom, and he is very aggressive in trying to, complete Hellenization. He wants to get rid of any remaining Jewish influence in Israel. And so in 167, he desecrates the temple, he erects a pagan altar, and he outlaws the Jewish religion. And so this includes practices like circumcision and observing the Sabbath. And his reign is just really oppressive. And so as a result of these efforts to stamp out Judaism, rebellion flares up. And so now we get to the Maccabean revolt. And so because of Antiochus's laws that he was putting into effect, there was a priest named Mattathias who had 5 sons. They're known as the Hasmonean family, and they launched the Maccabean revolt. And so these rebels, using guerrilla tactics, began to try and oust Greek influence from Israel. Mattathias dies in 166 BC, leaving the leadership of the movement to his son, Judas Maccabeus. That's where we get the name, the Maccabean Revolt, named after him. And Maccabeus, when translated, means the hammer. So he was Judas the Hammer. Pretty cool name. All the hammer time jokes. Anyway, so the revolution continues. There are some key victories that are won against the Seleucid forces, and the Jewish forces are successfully able to recapture Jerusalem. And so the temple is purified and rededicated. And this rededication is celebrated in the festival of Hanukkah. And Hanukkah means dedication. So this is something that's still celebrated today by Jewish people. And the really interesting thing about Hanukkah is, you obviously have this really awesome story about how there was not enough oil for the menorah in the temple, but it miraculously burned for 8 days. Super cool. And so that's why you see lots of menorahs for Hanukkah. Pretty awesome. Okay, so after Judas is killed, his brother becomes the leader, and he actually negotiates with one of several individuals who are trying to take over the Seleucid throne, because there's kind of a civil war going on for who is going to lead the Seleucid Empire. And so he takes advantage of the Seleucid weakness, and he is appointed high priest and governor, and in return he says that he'll be loyal to the Seleucid Empire, or the Seleucid kingdom. And so this gives us a period in which the Jews are essentially autonomous. The Maccabees are in charge, the Hasmonean family, but they still acknowledge that the Seleucids are technically their overlords. And so during this period, we start to see some sects emerge that we probably will all recognize, such as the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And like I mentioned earlier, these factions come about because the Jews are debating, to what extent should we oppose Hellenization? And they have, disputes about who should legitimately lead the faith. All right, so now we're coming into a period in which the Hasmonean dynasty is independent. So Jonathan's brother, Simon, takes Jonathan's place eventually, and because the Seleucids are weakened, Simon is actually able to secure full independence, whereas before they were sort of independent, but not really. So the last Seleucids are kicked out, and the Jews become fully independent, and Simon becomes the prince or the ethnarch and the high priest. And so now we have the beginning of the Hasmonean dynasty of priest kings, fully independent. Okay, Simon's son, John Hyrcanus I, rules after Simon is assassinated, and he expands the kingdom of Israel to about the same extent as the ancient kingdom of Israel. And so he conquers this region to the south that I have labeled here as Idumea. He conquers this group of people and forces them to convert to Judaism. So Herod the Great, his grandfather, is actually one of these Idumeans. And as part of this expansion, Hyrcanus also destroys the Samaritan temple, which is on Mount Gerizim. And this is something that's mentioned in the New Testament, actually, when Jesus talks to the Samaritan woman. Okay, so now we're getting into Hasmonean decline. So a few generations after Hyrcanus, there's a civil war that erupts between two brothers, a different Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. After the death of their mother, the queen, both brothers want to be the one in charge, and so both invite Rome to intervene on their behalf. And so Roman legions under Pompey show up. In 63 BC, Pompey marches on Jerusalem, and he besieges it and captures it. And when he does this, this ends a period of 80 years in which the Hasmoneans were a sovereign nation. And so, as a result of this, the Hasmonean kingdom becomes a client state, and Rome divides up much of its territory among neighboring provinces. Okay, and now we're getting into the Roman conquest and the Herodian era. This is the stage for the New Testament. We're almost there, guys. Okay, so Roman rule is established. Judea becomes subordinate to a larger province, the province of Syria. And so you have Roman governors and, just like puppet rulers who are overseeing this region. After Pompey, Julius Caesar, who I have on the right here, comes into power, and he shows favor to the Jews, and he appoints Antipater, so this is the father of Herod the Great, as the ruler of Judea. He's called the procurator. And after Caesar's assassination, the Roman Empire is thrown into turmoil, and so the Hasmonean heir, he briefly regains power. And so in response to this, the Roman Senate names Herod, Antipater's son, because Antipater is now dead. They name him king of Judea, and they send him troops to help counter this rebellion. So Herod comes in, he invades, recaptures Jerusalem, executes the Hasmoneans, and he becomes a new client king under Roman authority, starts his own new dynasty. And so Herod, not a very nice guy. He executes anyone who he perceives as being a threat to his power, and this includes his wife, his brother-in-law, several of his sons. And he does all of this just to secure his throne, secure his power. And because he's not very popular, he decides to try and make the people like him. He's going to expand and renovate the second temple. This is the one that was rebuilt after the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem under Cyrus. Anyway, so he expands this temple, and this starts around 20 BC, and he makes it just an amazing structure. And I have a picture of what we think it might have looked like here on this right-hand side. Okay, now the moment we've all been waiting for. It's time for Jesus. Okay, so according to Matthew and Luke, Jesus is born in Bethlehem during Herod's reign. Should be a period there. According to Matthew, so Herod learns that, the new king of the Jews has been born, and so he orders the massacre of infants in Bethlehem. And so we know historically Herod died around 4 BC, and so we often date Jesus' birth to the range of 6 to 4 BC, because obviously, you'd have to have been born sometime before Herod died. So, after Herod's death, Augustus, who took over after Caesar was assassinated, he partitions Herod's kingdom among Herod's surviving sons. Amazing that he still has some of those, frankly, considering how many he assassinated, or I guess executed is more accurate. But one of his sons, Archelaus, gets Judea and Samaria, which I have highlighted here in red. And he gets Idumea as well. Herod Antipas gets Galilee and Perea, which I have here in green. And then his other son, Philip, gets Golan and Iturea. Frankly, Philip is not nearly as important to the New Testament narrative. He shows up for a minute, but not much. Mostly the green and the red areas here on the map are where the New Testament events are taking place. And so Archelaus, the one who's ruling in the red, Judea and Samaria, because he is not a good ruler, he is eventually deposed by Rome in about AD 6. And so after that, Judea comes under the direct supervision of Rome. And so Rome sends, these guys named prefects to govern Judea. And so Pontius Pilate is one of these prefects. Okay, the life of Jesus. A lot of this stuff I think we'll all be pretty familiar with, so I might not go into as much depth on some of these events, but as I think we all know, Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist in the Jordan River, and this kind of starts his ministry. Jesus begins to gather disciples, Peter, James, John, all those guys. He travels through Judea, Samaria, and Galilee, and he's preaching about the kingdom of God. And during this time period, Jesus is performing miracles, he's healing people, raising the dead, and of course, he's teaching in his parables. And unfortunately, this makes him somewhat unpopular with some of the Jewish authorities, such as the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And speaking of them, we need to have this important side tangent. What is the deal with Pharisees and the Sadducees? So let's talk about it. To start off, it's worth noting that at this point, there was not really one Judaism. It was more like Judaisms, plural. There were different denominations, kind of like how there are lots of denominations of Christianity today. And so there are some important groups that we should know, starting with the Pharisees. So these guys are all about both the oral and the written law. And so they would accept most of the books that we consider to be the Old Testament today. And so they believed that all people should try to live the lives of consecrated priests. They believed in angels and the resurrection. And one of the big things that they did is they established the synagogues. So it kind of makes sense why they might be upset with Jesus when he's coming into the synagogues, which was their space, and teaching the people. They felt like he was kind of encroaching on their domain. And the really interesting thing about the Pharisees is they're actually the precursors to Rabbinic Judaism. So all Jews today, for the most part, descend from the Pharisees. Kind of cool. And they're the only group of the groups that we're about to talk about that didn't get wiped out when the Romans came in and wiped out Jerusalem in about 70 AD. Unless you count, Jewish Christians, but that's maybe a different story there. So the next group that we should talk about is the Sadducees, and they were not okay with the oral law. It was only the written law, and so they were the 5 books of Moses alone, sometimes known as the Pentateuch. They said just that, and if it's not in these 5 books, we're not going to believe in it. And so for that reason, they don't believe in angels, and they don't believe in the resurrection. Additionally, the Sadducees were the priestly class, so they were the ones who were in charge of the temple. So you might understand why the Sadducees were upset with Jesus when Jesus came into the temple and cleansed it. They would feel like he was usurping their authority. The next group that we should talk about is the Essenes. So these guys were big into asceticism, which is basically denying the body of like earthly pleasures. So they actually performed baptisms, and they were trying to become a holier people in the midst of Judaism. They did not like the Hellenization that was going on. They wanted to reject that. And so it is possible, actually, that John the Baptist may have been an Essene. There seem to be a lot of parallels between him and the Essenes. And another interesting little tidbit is the Jews at Qumran. You might know of them as the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were actually Essenes as well. And at around the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, the Essenes hid all of their writings, their sacred writings, in these caves, probably with the intent to come back for them, but unfortunately they were all wiped out, so no one ever did come back for them until they were found much, much later in the 1940s, I think. Okay, the Samaritans. So they, like the Sadducees, also only accepted the first 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch. They worshipped at Mount Gerizim, which I referred to earlier, and you can see it on the map here right by Shechem. So they worship there instead of Jerusalem. That's why, like I said before, Jesus talks with the Samaritan woman and says, the Jews say that we should worship in Jerusalem. You want to worship at Gerizim, but someday it won't matter where you worship. That whole thing comes up because the Samaritans worshipped at Gerizim. They were seen as heretical and ritually impure by most Jews because they were of mixed blood. Because when the Assyrians came in and invaded the northern kingdom, and this was back before the Babylonian conquest. So, like I said, the Assyrians came in, wiped out the northern kingdom, hauled them all off. This is where we lose the lost 10 tribes. It's because of the Assyrians. And so when the Assyrians haul these people off, they bring other people who they've conquered and move them into Samaria. And so some of the inhabitants who still remain, who are Jews, they intermarry with these new people who are brought in, and people down in Judea and up in Galilee aren't happy about this, and so they say, no, you're not a part of our group, you are impure at this point. So that's why you have this long-standing animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans. Really quick, a couple other groups. The Zealots. So these are Jews who were committed to ending Roman rule, and so they would assassinate rulers or officials and things like that. So Simon the Zealot, one of Jesus' apostles, he was likely a part of this group. There are these Hellenized Jews who, to varying extents, adopt Greek ways. And then you have the Herodians. And these are actually kind of a subset of the Hellenized Jews, but they are a group that supported the rule of Herod and his descendants of the Herodian dynasty, and they are supportive of collaboration with Rome. Okay, and now back to our story. So, back to Jesus' ministry. Around AD 29, John the Baptist is executed by Herod Antipas, because Herod's wife Herodias was not a fan of John the Baptist. This is one of the few times when Philip, the son of Herod the Great, is mentioned, because Herodias was previously Philip's wife, and if you remember, Herod Antipas and Philip were brothers. John was not very happy with Herod Antipas for marrying his brother's wife. So that's why all of that unpleasantness went down. So Jesus' fame continues to grow as he continues to preach and perform miracles. He started to be hailed as the Messiah, or the Greek Christ. Authorities in Jerusalem, like the high priest Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, which was kind of like the ruling body of the Jews, they felt threatened by Jesus' popularity and teachings. So eventually we get to a climax. Jesus comes to Jerusalem for the Passover, and he is arrested following the Last Supper with his disciples. He is put on trial by the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin that I just mentioned, and by Pontius Pilate, and then he is sentenced to death by crucifixion. And this was the Roman method of execution. This was typically only reserved for certain types of crimes, typically treason. And so Jesus would fall into this category because the accusation that was leveled against him when they brought Jesus to the Romans was that he was declaring himself to be a king of the Jews. And the only king for Rome is Caesar, so that's not okay. And so Jesus was crucified for that reason. And that happens at Golgotha, just outside of Jerusalem, and Jesus dies on the cross. Okay, according to the New Testament, Jesus, after 3 days, or rather on the third day, he is raised from the dead, and he appears to his disciples over 40 days. And shortly after Jesus' resurrection, it's recorded that he ascends into heaven after speaking with his disciples on the Mount of Olives, and he leaves behind the Great Commission. And he basically tells his followers they need to go share the gospel with the world. Shortly following this, we have the Jewish Feast of Pentecost, and on this occasion, the Holy Spirit descends on the disciples and those who are with them. They speak in tongues, and about 3,000 new believers are added to the church. Pretty cool. And so, at this time, the early Christian community is centered in Jerusalem. It's led by the apostles. They live communally, and they continue to worship at the temple. Temple worship doesn't cease, which is very interesting. There's still some links to their former, religion of Judaism. They have not fully severed all ties in that way. And so now we're getting into the early church era. So, following Christ's death, Christianity grows rapidly, and the apostles are performing miracles. They are preaching to the people about Christ's resurrection, and so this alarms the Jewish authorities because they're like, well, we just killed this guy, and now his apostles are causing even more people to follow after him, even though he's dead. And so as a result of this concern that the Jewish authorities are feeling, Stephen, who is one of the first deacons, he's a leader in the church, he's a very powerful preacher, he is arrested, and he becomes the first Christian martyr. He's stoned to death for his bold preaching. And so Stephen's death triggers a local persecution against the church in and around Jerusalem under a man who was present for Stephen's execution, Saul of Tarsus, who was a Pharisee. And as a result of this persecution, many believers fled Jerusalem, and as they flee, they spread the gospel message with them to Samaria and other regions. And because Saul wants to continue his persecution outside of Jerusalem, he is sent on the road to Damascus, and on the way, he has this vision in which he sees the resurrected Christ. He has this conversation with him in which Christ tells him to stop persecuting him and his church, and Saul is blinded. And so after this encounter, Paul is converted, and he changed, I think I said Paul. Saul is converted, and then he changes his name to Paul. And so then after this, Paul spends the next few years learning and engaging in preaching the gospel. And in AD 46, he joins Barnabas in Antioch, and the church begins, they decide to commission them essentially as missionaries. They send them out to go preach the gospel more broadly. And so at this point, Herod Agrippa I, he's the grandson of Herod. He is the king of Judea. And to please certain Jewish groups, Agrippa, again, persecutes the church. There's lots of persecution going on here, sensing a theme. And so as part of this persecution, he executes James, the son of Zebedee. And he also imprisons Peter, who is able to miraculously escape. And then not terribly long after this, Agrippa passes away. So going back to Paul and Barnabas, they take off from Antioch, where they were commissioned as missionaries. And they go through Cyprus and Asia Minor, which is today Turkey. And they preached to both Jews and Gentiles. They established some of the first Gentile churches in a region called Galatia, which is a pretty broad area with lots of different groups mixed in there. But anyway, they raise the question of whether people who are not Jews have to first convert to Judaism in order to join the Christian movement, if we want to call it that. And there's a big debate over this, whether or not you first have to convert to Judaism. And so to deal with this issue, we have the Council of Jerusalem. So the apostles and elders of the church, they have a council in Jerusalem. It's talked about in Acts 15. And so there are some key leaders, Peter, Paul, Barnabas, and James, who's the brother of Jesus. And so they have this conversation about what should we do about the Gentile problem. And so they come up with a couple of, we'll call them rules or guidelines. I have listed here decrees that are going to be binding on the church. So they say, no, Gentiles don't need to be circumcised. They don't need to keep the law of Moses, aside from a few specific things. And then they lay out what those are. You're not supposed to eat meat sacrificed to idols. You're not supposed to eat animals that have been strangled. And there's, a few other things that they list. But for the most part, you don't need to keep the law of Moses in order to join the Christian movement. And so after this council, we're getting into the 50s now. Paul embarks on some additional missionary journeys. So this is his second journey, because if you remember his original one, he started out in Antioch, goes through Galatia. So on this journey, he goes through Greece in his second journey, and then in his third journey, he focuses on Ephesus and then revisiting some churches that he had been to previously. And during this time period, Paul writes many of the epistles that we have in the New Testament, and I gave some examples here, such as Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, and Romans. And he's providing teaching and then just addressing issues that pop up in the early communities. If you've read the epistles of Paul, he's constantly telling people, why are you doing that? Stop that. And at this time period, it's not just Paul who is preaching the gospel. There are others who are engaged in the work as well. And so we have traditions that say that Thomas went as far as India. We have traditions that say that Mark goes to Egypt. These don't come from the New Testament. These are external traditions that come later. Some of them are more reliable than others. So, you just kind of have to take them with a grain of salt, decide what you want to believe about them. But there's that. And so upon returning to Jerusalem in AD 57, Paul is arrested because of some accusations that are made by the Jews, and Paul is worried about execution, so he invokes his right as a Roman citizen, which means he cannot be tried by the Jews, he has to be tried by Caesar. And so he's imprisoned for 2 years in Caesarea, and then he is sent to Rome. And so the book of Acts ends with Paul under house arrest in Rome. He is able to preach to anyone who wants to come and visit him, according to Acts. And so during this time period, while he's imprisoned, Paul writes some letters, oftentimes known as the prison epistles, and some examples are Philippians and Philemon. And eventually, Paul was executed under Nero during another period of persecution of the Christians. So in AD 64, a great fire devastates the city of Rome. The emperor, Nero, he blamed the Christians for the fire because there are suspicions that he was the one who started the fire. And he wants to kind of, shift the blame from himself. It's unclear if he was responsible or not, but regardless, he doesn't want to be associated with the city burning down. And so this leads to the first official persecution of the Christians in Rome. There were unofficial persecutions prior to this time, but this is the first one that is being instigated by the empire itself. And so during this persecution, many Christians were executed in gruesome ways, and some individuals who fell prey include the apostles Peter and Paul. And so in AD 66, in response to this persecution, the Jews revolt against the Roman Empire. And unfortunately, in AD 70, Jerusalem is besieged and destroyed by Titus, who later becomes emperor. The Romans burn the city, and they destroy the Second Temple. And according to the Jewish historian Josephus, over 1 million Jews were killed or enslaved during the siege of Jerusalem. And so, coming to the end here, John, the son of Zebedee, The last surviving apostle is exiled to the island of Patmos, and it is believed that in around AD 95, John receives a series of visions, which are recorded in the book of Revelation, the last book in the New Testament, at least in the order in which we have them today. And so with this, the New Testament effectively comes to a close. Okay. And so that is everything that I've got for you. If you have any questions, I guess feel free to put them in the comments below, and I will do my best to answer them. Thank you all for listening.